"I dream about your body," the mountain man declared to the obese labor girl. He bought. The town laughed when the bidding began. Dust hung in the air, boots scraped against the boardwalk, and the girl on the block hung her head in shame. Nobody wanted her, nobody but one man. A scarred mountain drifter stepped forward, slammed his silver down, and claimed her as his own. But when night fell and the fire burned low, he whispered something no one expected. "I dream about your body," not with cruel to know, with reverence. And just when she thought she'd found a protector, the truth hit harder than any insult. A ruthless syndicate wants his land, and they'll burn it all to ash to drive them out. Now, mocked by neighbors, hunted by greed, and torn between shame and hope, this outcast woman must choose whether to hide in fear or fight for a home she never thought she deserved. Will the mountain man's vow be enough to protect her? Or will the very dream that gave her hope be the reason they lose everything? Every story brings us a little closer together. Before we dive in, drop a comment with where you're tuning in from. It's a joy to see how far this family of listeners reaches. The first light of dawn painted the mountain peaks in gold as Liam Bracken guided his mule down the winding trail toward Miller's trading post. His weathered face bore the marks of weeks spent alone in the high country, and his saddlebags bulged with carefully wrapped beaver pelts. The lonely howl of a distant wolf echoed his own solitude. The crunch of his mule's hooves on gravel shifted to hollow thuds as they reached the wooden bridge leading into town. Liam had planned this trip carefully: trade the furs, stock up on winter supplies, and return to his cabin before the first heavy snows. But fate had other ideas. The trading post's usual morning quiet was broken by a crowd's rumble. Liam's mule's ears twitched at the noise as they rounded the last bend. Instead of the usual handful of traders and townspeople, at least 50 men clustered around a rough wooden platform erected in front of the store. "Step right up, gentlemen," a thin man in a dusty black coat called out. "Labor contract auction about to begin." Liam's jaw tightened. Labor auctions were legal, but barely. Too often they masked a darker trade in human misery. He turned his mule toward the hitching post, intending to wait out the crowd, when a collective laugh drew his attention back to the platform. There stood a woman, broad-shouldered and full-figured, her face blazing red as she stared at her feet. Her plain brown dress couldn't hide her ample curves, which drew crude comments from the crowd. Liam recognized the shame in her downturned eyes. It was the same look he'd seen in the mirror after the war. When his scars drew stares, "I bid for this fine specimen?" The auctioneer's voice dripped with mockery. Strong as an ox, though perhaps just as useful. More laughter rippled through the crowd. Hannah Mae Hollister, the auctioneer, continued contracted to pay her father's medical debts. "Good for farm work if you've got enough feed." The crowd roared again. But Liam saw how each word struck the woman like a physical blow. Something stirred in Liam's chest, a feeling he thought long buried under years of mountain solitude. Before he could think better of it, he was dismounting, his boots striking the packed earth with purpose. $5, someone shouted. "10, called another, followed by cruel laughter. Liam's hand went to the leather pouch at his belt, heavy with silver meant for winter supplies. He'd survived harsh winters before. He could do it again. 25 silver dollars. His quiet voice cut through the jeers. The crowd parted, turning to stare at the scarred mountain man who'd spoken. The auctioneer's eyebrows shot up. 25 going once. Has the mountain man lost his mind? Someone muttered. Going twice? Hannah Mae's eyes finally lifted, meeting Liam's steady gaze. In that moment, he saw not shame, but a spark of something deeper. Strength, perhaps. Or hope, sold. The gavel crack echoed across the suddenly quiet square. Liam stepped forward, counting out the silver pieces one by one. The crowd's mockery followed him up to the platform, but he paid it no mind. He'd learned long ago that other men's opinions meant little against the judgment of his own conscience. He offered Hannah Mae his arm, noticing how she trembled as she took it. "You're safe now," he said softly, leading her through the dispersing crowd to where his mule waited. They left town immediately, Liam leading the mule while Hannah Mae walked beside him. Neither spoke until the sun began to set, and Liam chose a sheltered spot to make camp. He could feel her tension, her expectation of harshness or demands. Instead, he built a small fire and shared his trail bread and jerky as the stars began. To appear above them, he finally spoke, his voice rough but gentle. "I dream about your body," he said simply, looking into the flames rather than at her shocked expression. "Because it looks like life against the winter. Warmth, shelter, a place I want to belong." In the firelight, he saw her hands tremble as they clutched her skirts. Her breath caught, and he knew she was trying to decide if this was truth or pity. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the pop and crack of burning wood and the distant cry of a Niksh tbird. Liam added another stick to the fire, patient, letting his words settle. He'd spent enough years in the mountains to know that some things, like trust, couldn't be rushed. Like the spring thaw, they had to come in their own time. Morning came with a bitter bite, frost glittering on their bedrolls like scattered diamonds. Clara blinked awake in the small tent, her muscles stiff from sleeping on the hard ground. Outside, she heard Liam stirring the campfire back to life, the snap and pop of fresh kindling breaking, the dawn silence. Her cheeks burned as she remembered his words from the night before. No man had ever spoken to her that way, with gentleness instead of mockery. Seeing strength where others saw only size, she smoothed her wrinkled dress, gathered her courage, and ducked out of the tent. Liam crouched by the fire, spooning beans into a blackened pot. His scarred hands moved with careful precision, and Clara found herself studying those weathered fingers. Each mark told a story of survival, of work and hardship. He wasn't like the soft-handed townsman who'd laughed at her shame. "Morning," he said quietly, not looking up from his task. "Sleep well?" Clara nodded, then remembered he wasn't watching. "Yes, thank you." She kept her eyes on the flames, unsure how to face him after his confession. They ate in silence, the beans, warm in their tin cups. As soon as they finished, Liam began breaking down the camp with practiced efficiency. Clara helped fold the tent. Though her cold fingers fumbled with the canvas dot, the mule stood patiently as Liam loaded their supplies onto a wooden sled. "Roads are too rough for a wagon this time of year," he explained. His first full sentence of the morning, the animal's breath came out in white puffs against the cold air. They set out northward, the mule's hooves and the sled's runners leaving parallel tracks in the frost-covered earth. Clara walked beside the sled, stealing glances at her quiet companion. His face remained forward, watching the road ahead as it wound toward distant mountains, the rutted track made for slow going. Every few minutes, the sled would catch on a frozen ridge or sink into a mud-filled hollow. Each time, Liam would stop, adjust the load, and urge the mule forward with gentle words. By late afternoon, they passed the last outlying farms of the town. A group of ranch hands paused in their fence-mending to watch them pass. Clara's stomach tightened as their laughter carried across the field. "Hey, Bracken," one called out. "Found yourself an ox-wife to match them mountains." Clara's shoulders hunched, the familiar shame washing over her. She saw Liam's jaw clench, the muscle working beneath his beard, but he said nothing. His hand tightened on the mule's lead rope as he quickened their pace, putting distance between them and the cruel voices. The sun was setting when Liam finally called a halt beside a clear-running creek. The water chattered over rocks, a peaceful sound that seemed to wash away the day's hurts. While he tended to the mule, Clara gathered dry wood for the fire. Determined to make herself useful, Liam pulled cornbread from his saddlebags, breaking it into equal shares. The simple food tasted better than any fine meal Clara had known in town, perhaps because it was freely shared rather than grudgingly given. After they ate, Clara insisted on taking the tin plates to the creek. She said when Liam began to protest, "I want to help." She needed him to see she wasn't helpless, wasn't the burden everyone claimed. The creek water was ice cold, numbing her hands as she scrubbed the plates clean with sand. Behind her, she heard Liam setting up the tent, his movements efficient and quiet. When she returned, he had his blanket rolled out near the fire, leaving the tent for her use again. Inside the canvas shelter, Clara knelt in the darkness. "Dear God," she whispered, then stopped, uncertain. How long had it been since she'd truly prayed, since she'd believed anyone, divine or mortal, was listening? The words stuck in her throat. Through the tent walls came the sound of Liam's voice, soft and rough, humming a tune she half remembered from childhood church services. The melody was broken, like he'd forgotten parts, or perhaps had never learned. them properly, the sound stirred something in her chest, pain and comfort tangled together. Like the thorny roses that sometimes bloomed in mountain valleys, Clara lay down on her blanket, listening to that imperfect hymn floating up toward the stars. In its broken notes, she heard an echo of her own struggles to find faith again. Sleep came slowly, carried on the current of Liam's humming and the creek's endless song. The third morning greeted them with pewter skies and a bitter wind that cut through Clara's shawl. Her bones ached from 2 nights on hard ground, but she pressed her lips together, determined not to complain as they prepared for the final leg of their journey. Eli held the mule steady while Clara attempted to mount. Her legs trembled with the effort unused to climbing onto an animal's back. Twice she tried and failed, her cheeks burning with each unsuccessful attempt. On the third try, she managed to haul herself up, though not with any grace. Eli said nothing, simply checked the sled's ropes one last time before leading them toward the foothills. Pine trees grew thicker as they climbed, their branches heavy with last night's frost. The air grew sharper, carrying the clean scent of evergreen and winter. The mule picked its way carefully along the narrowing track, while Eli walked ahead, his stride sure despite the rough terrain. Midday, Eli stopped so suddenly that Clara had to pull back on the reins. He pointed toward the horizon, where a thin line of smoke rose against the gray sky. "Home," he said, the word carrying a weight of relief. After days of travel, Clara felt her own tension ease at the sight. But as they descended into the valley, Eli's posture changed. His shoulders stiffened, and his pace slowed. Clara soon saw why 3 riders waited near a crude fence line, their horses stamping in the cold. The men sat straight-backed in their saddles, wearing city clothes that looked out of place against the mountain backdrop. The largest man, wearing a black bowler hat, urged his horse forward. "Mr. Bracken," he called out, his voice carrying false warmth, "I'm Theodore Walsh, representing the Western Railroad Syndicate." He pulled papers from his coat. "We've come about the matter of this property." Eli moved to stand between the riders and Clara. "This is my land. Built every fence post myself." Walsh's smile didn't reach his eyes. "According to these documents, this valley was deeded to the railroad 2 months ago. We'll be requiring you to vacate the premises." "That's not possible," Eli growled. "I've worked this land 5 years. Got the paperwork to prove it." "I'm afraid your claim wasn't properly registered." Walsh's smirk deepened, "though I see you've already found yourself some substantial help for the move." His gaze slid to Clara, and his companions snickered. Clara felt the familiar shame rise up, but something else rose with it, anger at these polished men, who thought they could steal a home with nothing but papers and sneers. "You have until the end of the month," Walsh said, tossing the documents at Eli's feet. "After that, we'll remove you ourselves." The riders wheeled their horses around and galloped away, leaving clouds of dust and the echo of their laughter. Eli stood frozen for a long moment before retrieving the scattered papers. His cabin sat 100 yards away, a sturdy structure of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney. A home he'd built with his own hands, now threatened by men who'd never worked a day in their lives. Inside, the cabin was simple but clean, with a stone hearth and sturdy furniture Eli had crafted himself. As evening approached, Clara examined the documents the railroad men had left. The edges were singed, as if someone had tried to burn them, but the text remained clear, legal language that seemed to give the railroad company right to everything Eli had built. "We should pray about this," Clara suggested softly, watching Eli pace the cabin's length like a caged animal. He stopped, his face harsh in the fading light. "Tried that years ago, got nothing but silence back." He turned away. The firelight cast dancing shadows on the walls as she bowed her head. "Dear Lord," she began, her voice trembling but growing stronger, "we need your shelter now. Give us strength to face what's coming." Tears slid down her cheeks, catching the flame's glow. "Please don't let them take this home." Eli stood in the shadows, watching her pray. His face remained unreadable, but his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, as if fighting some internal battle. The snow fell harder outside, blanketing the threatened land in white, while inside, Clara's whispered prayers mixed with the crackling of the fire and the sound of Eli's restless breathing. The snow fell through the night, transforming the valley into a white blanket by morning. Clara woke to find Eli already stoking the hearth fire, his movements precise and practiced. He glanced up as she emerged from the small side room he'd given her. "Reckon we ought to get you settled into daily tasks," he said, his voice gentle. "Nothing too hard at first." Clara nodded eagerly, though her stomach knotted with worry about failing. Eli led her to the water barrel by the door. "We'll need fresh water from the creek," he explained. "Then there's vegetables need chopping for supper, and some mending I've been putting off." The water bucket was heavy, but Clara gripped it firmly, determined to prove herself useful. The path to the creek was slippery with fresh snow, and she had to stop twice to catch her breath. When she returned, cheeks flushed from exertion, Eli took the filled bucket with a quiet "well done." Those two simple words warmed her more than the fire. At the rough wooden table, Clara found comfort in the steady rhythm of chopping carrots and potatoes. Her hands, though thick, moved with surprising grace through the task. When Eli passed by to add wood to the fire, she caught him nodding at her neat pile of vegetables. "Ma always said cooking was a form of caring," she ventured, then held her breath, unsure how he'd respond to her words. "Reckon she was right about that," he replied softly. By midday, Clara felt restless inside the cabin. Despite the cold, she pulled on her shawl and stepped out into the snow. "Let me carry some," she offered. Clara caught him watching her once, his expression thoughtful, as if seeing something in her clumsy determination that others had missed. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Clara set about preparing stew with the vegetables she'd chopped earlier. The familiar task filled the cabin with warm, homey scents that seemed to soften its rough edges. But she noticed how he breathed deeply when the cooking smells reached him. "My mother," he said suddenly, his voice rough with memory. "She used to say faith was like bread, needed fresh every day." He paused, knife stilling in his hands. "You remind me of her sometimes." That same quiet strength. Clara's hands trembled. As she stirred the stew, gathering her courage, she went to fetch her most precious possession, a leather-bound Bible, its pages soft from years of turning. "Would you mind," she asked carefully, "if I read a bit?" When Eli nodded, she opened to Psalm 46, the words as familiar as her own heartbeat. "God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble," she began, her voice growing steadier with each verse. "Therefore will not we fear, though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea." Eli leaned back in his chair, eyes closed, listening. The fire crackled, and snow whispered against the windows, but Clara's words filled the cabin with something warmer than heat. Hope, maybe, or at least its possibility. Later, as they ate stew at the table, Clara noticed a tear in Eli's coat hanging by the door. "I could mend that for you," she offered. "If you'd like." Eli studied her for a long moment, then rose and brought her the coat. The gesture felt significant. A piece of himself he was willing to trust in her hands. Clara smoothed the rough fabric across her lap, her needle moving with sure, even stitches as she worked. Snow continued to swirl outside, but inside the cabin, something was shifting. Settling into place, Clara felt it as she sat at the table across from Eli, sharing the stew she'd made in his home. No, their home, at least for now. For the first time in more years than she cared to count, she didn't feel like a burden or a joke. Here, in this simple cabin with this quiet man, she felt like she belonged. The evening passed in comfortable silence, broken only by the snap of the fire and the soft sound of their spoons against the bowls. Clara's heart felt full, not with grand dreams or wild hopes, but with the simple rightness of being exactly where she was meant to be. The morning sun pierced through clearing skies, casting long shadows across the snow-covered valley. Clara stood at the cabin window, admiring how the fresh powder sparkled like scattered diamonds. The peaceful moment shattered as thundering hoofbeats approached. A boy, no more than 12, reined his horse to a sliding stop before their door. His face was red from cold and exertion, tears frozen on his cheeks. Eli opened the door before the boy could pound on it. "Please," the boy gasped, his breath coming in frightened clouds. "My sister Sarushi's burning up with fever. Ma sent me to find help? You're the closest neighbors we got." Clara stepped forward, her heart racing. "How long has she been sick?" "Started yesterday. Now she's not making sense when she talks." The boy's voice cracked. "Please come." Clara turned to Eli, her eyes pleading. He was already reaching for his coat. "I'll hitch the mule to the sled," he said firmly, while Eli prepared their transport. Clara gathered what supplies she could think of: clean cloths, her mother's old tin of dried herbs she always carried, and extra blankets. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked, remembering her mother's teachings about healing. The ride to the neighbor's cabin was tense and silent, save for the crunch of snow beneath. The sled runners. Clara held tight to her supplies, praying she remembered enough of her mother's wisdom to help. When they arrived, Sarah's mother met them at the door, her face drawn with worry. Inside, the small cabin felt stifling. Sarah lay on a narrow bed, her face flushed crimson, dark hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. Clara moved quickly to the girl's side, laying a gentle hand on her burning forehead. "How long has she been this hot?" "Since midnight," Sarah's mother whispered, wringing her hands. "I've tried everything I know." Clara opened her tin of herbs, sorting through them with practiced fingers. "Eli," she called, "I need water boiled, and lots of it." He nodded and set to work at the cook stove. From her stores, Clara pulled dried echinacea and willow bark. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. Echinacea for the fever, willow bark for the pain. She measured careful portions into a cup, then added the boiling water Eli brought. "It'll taste bitter," she warned as she helped Sarah sip the tea. The girl grimaced but swallowed obediently. Through the long night, Clara kept her vigil. She bathed Sarah's face and neck with cool cloths, watching for any change. When the girl grew restless, Clara sang the hymns her mother had taught her, soft and low. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound, Eli stayed to, keeping the fire stoked and brewing fresh tea whenever Clara called for it. His presence was steady, supportive, though he spoke little. As false dawn began to lighten the windows, Sarah's fever finally broke. The girl's eyes opened, clear and aware for the first time in hours. "I'm thirsty," she whispered. Her mother burst into tears of relief, gathering Sarah into her arms. Clara sat back, exhausted but smiling as the family embraced. She felt Eli's hand rest briefly on her shoulder, warm and approving. The boy who'd fetched them hugged Clara tight around the middle. "Thank you for saving my sister," he said, voice muffled against her dress. On the sled ride home, Clara found herself nodding off, the night's tension draining away. Eli wrapped an extra blanket around her shoulders. "Rest," he said softly. "You've earned it." That evening, as Clara stirred their supper pot, Eli returned from checking the mule. His expression was thoughtful. "Heard talk in town today," he said, hanging his coat. "Word spread about what you did for Sarah." Clara's spoon stilled. "Some folks still want to scoff, but others," he paused, watching her face carefully, "others are speaking of you with respect, calling you a healer." Clara felt her cheeks warm. "I only did what my mother taught me." "You've got a healer's hands," Eli said firmly, "gentle but strong, the kind that know how to help." Clara touched her Bible where it lay on the table, its familiar leather binding comforting under her fingers. She thought of her mother, who had taught her that every person had gifts to share, if only they were given the chance. For the first time, she felt the truth of those words in her own life. She looked up to find Eli watching her, pride evident in his usually guarded expression. Something warm bloomed in her chest, not just pride in herself, but gratitude for this man who had seen value in her. When others saw only sighs and shame, the evening settled around them like a comfortable blanket as Clara returned to stirring their supper, her heart full of quiet joy. The Sunday morning dawned crisp and bright, sunlight glinting off fresh snow. Clara stood before the cabin's clouded mirror, adjusting her best dress with trembling fingers, the fabric pulled tight across her broad shoulders, making her wince. Eli watched from the doorway, already dressed in his freshly brushed coat. "We don't have to go," he said softly, noting her distress. Clara squared her shoulders. "Yes, we do. The Lord gives us strength when we need it most." They hitched the mule to the sled and made their way down the mountain path toward the small white church nestled in the valley. The bell tolled across the snow-covered landscape, calling the faithful to worship. Clara's grip tightened on her Bible as they approached. At the church steps, she hesitated. Through the windows, she could see people already seated, heads turning. To watch their arrival, Eli reached for her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. The warmth of his rough palm steadied her, and together they climbed the wooden steps. The door creaked as they entered. Heads swiveled and whispers rustled through. The pews, like dry leaves, Clara kept her eyes forward, following Eli to a bench near the back. The wood groaned under her weight as she sat, bringing fresh color to her cheeks as more whispers followed. The service began with Reverend Hopkins calling them to worship. When it came time for hymns, the pianist struck up Amazing Grace. Clara closed her eyes, letting the familiar melody wash over her. Then, drawing breath deep into her chest, she began to sing. Her voice rose clear and strong, filling the small space with rich, deep tones that seemed to make the very rafters vibrate. The other voices faltered for a moment, then joined in, carried along by her sure melody. Eli turned to stare, wonder playing on his weathered face. He had never heard such a sound, like warm honey poured over fresh bread, like summer wind through prairie grass. After the final amen, several people approached them. Sarah's mother was first, embracing Clara with tears in her eyes. "My girl's up and about now, thanks to you," she said warmly. Others followed, offering shy smiles and words of gratitude for her help with the sick child. But not everyone was won over. As they made their way toward the door, harsh whispers cut through the friendly chatter. "Bracken's bought mule," someone sneered, "probably eating him out of house and home. Wonder what he really bought her for," another voice added with ugly suggestion. Clara's steps faltered. She pushed past the remaining congregants and hurried outside, fighting to hold back tears until they were away from prying eyes. Eli followed close behind, his jaw clenched tight with anger. The walk home was silent, save for the squeak of snow beneath their boots. Only when they reached the cabin did Clara let the tears fall, hot tracks freezing on her cheeks in the winter air. That evening, as Clara sat by the fire reading her Bible, Eli paced the cabin like a caged bear. Finally, he stopped and lowered himself to his knees beside her chair. The gesture looked foreign on his strong frame, awkward yet determined. "I ain't prayed proper in 20 years, he said roughly. "Not since Shiloh. Lost both my brothers there, and James, watched James die right there in the mud. After that, seemed like God wasn't listening anymore, so I quit talking to him. Clara closed her Bible gently, her heart aching for his loss. "The Lord never stops listening, Eli, even when we stop speaking to him. Would you," he swallowed hard, "would you pray with me? Show me how again." Clara slid from her chair to kneel beside him, taking his calloused hand in hers. "Dear Lord," she began softly, "we thank you for second chances, for bringing lost sheep back to your fold, for healing broken hearts and wounded spirits." As she prayed, Eli's shoulders began to shake. Years of buried grief broke free like spring ice on a mountain stream. Clara held his hand tighter, her own tears falling as she continued to pray, asking for peace, for healing, for hope. When the last amen faded, they remained kneeling together in the firelight. Finally, Clara rose and prepared a simple meal of bread and tea. They ate in comfortable silence, their hearts heavy yet somehow lighter for being shared. The evening wrapped around them like a warm blanket, and though nothing had changed in the outside world, something fundamental had shifted between them, as if a missing piece had finally fallen into place. Winter's icy fingers gripped the mountain, valley tighter with each passing day. Snow drifted against the cabin walls, and bitter winds whistled through every tiny crack. But inside, warmth bloomed as Clara and Eli worked side by side to make the cabin more livable. Eli spent his mornings chopping fresh logs, the rhythmic thunk of his axe echoing across the snow-covered yard. His breath came out in white puffs, as he split wood after wood, building up their winter store. Clara watched him from the window as she worked her own. Magic indoors. She had discovered a stack of empty flour sacks in the storage room, their fabric still sturdy despite their age. With careful stitches, she transformed them into simple curtains, adding a touch of home to the rough-hewn windows. Every so often, she would pause in her sewing to admire how the fabric filtered the harsh winter light into something softer, more welcoming. One particularly cold afternoon, while Eli worked on the roof replacing worn shingles, Clara decided to surprise him. She retrieved the venison he had hung in the smokehouse and began preparing a stew the way her mother had taught her years ago. The familiar motions brought back warm memories of standing beside her mother at their old cook stove, learning the secret to tender meat and rich broth. The savory aroma filled the cabin just as Eli climbed down from the roof, his clothes dusted. With snow, he paused in the doorway, breathing in deeply. "Something smells mighty fine," he said, stamping his boots clean. Clara lifted the lid of the pot, releasing a cloud of steam. "My mama's recipe," she explained, stirring the thick stew. She always said good food could warm more than just the belly. Eli settled at the table, watching as she ladled the stew into bowls. His first spoonful brought a look of pure pleasure to his face. "This here's the best thing I've tasted in years," he declared. The praise brought a flush to Clara's cheeks, but this time something else bubbled up inside her. Joy, pure and simple. Before she knew it, laughter spilled from her lips, free. And unrestrained, it was the first time she had laughed, without trying to make herself smaller, without worrying about how she looked or sounded. Eli's smile grew wider at the sound. That evening, word came that neighbors were gathering at the church for an impromptu hymn sing. The winter storms had left many feeling isolated, and the community craved connection. Clara and Eli bundled up and made their way through the deepening twilight. The little church glowed with lamplight, its windows warm against the darkness. Inside, familiar faces turned to greet them, some friendly, others still carrying traces of judgment. Clara felt the old urge to shrink away, but Eli's steady presence beside her gave her courage as the group settled in to sing. Something shifted in Eli. He stood suddenly, drawing all eyes to him. In the hushed quiet, he cleared his throat. "Something to say," he announced, his voice rough but clear. "This woman here," he gestured to Clara, "is God's gift to me. Some of you've had cruel words about her size, made sport of her shame. But I'm standing here to tell you plain, I will stand by her, no matter her size or your scorn." Gasps rippled through the gathered crowd. Clara's hands flew to her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. Never in her life had anyone defended her so boldly, claimed her so proudly. The hymn sing continued, but something had changed. The atmosphere held a new weight, a recognition of the declaration they had witnessed. Clara's voice joined the others, strong and true, while Eli stood close. Beside her, his presence a shield against any remaining whispers. Later, as they rode home under a sky scattered with stars, Clara finally found her voice. "I never dreamed," she whispered, her words forming clouds in the cold air, "that anyone would claim me with pride, that anyone would stand up for me that way." Eli guided the mule carefully through the snow before responding. "You were never meant to hide," he said simply, as if stating an obvious truth. "The Lord made you exactly as you are, and I reckon He knew what He was about." Back at the cabin, they settled before the crackling fire. Clara worked on her mending while Eli cleaned his rifle, but there was a new closeness between them, a deeper understanding. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls and through the new curtains. The stars winked like distant promises. They sat together in comfortable silence, each lost in thought, but anchored by the other's presence. The winter wind sang around the cabin corners, but inside, warmth bloomed like spring flowers pushing through snow. Dawn brought a crisp, clear morning, the kind that made hope feel as tangible as sunlight. Clara woke early, her heart light as she moved around the cabin's small kitchen. The scent of baking biscuits filled every corner, golden and promising. She hummed softly while working the dough, her hands sure and steady now where they had once trembled with uncertainty. Near the hearth, Eli sat with his carving tools spread before him. Wood shavings curled around his boots as he shaped a new chair, his knife moving with careful precision. Every so often he would pause to study his work, testing the smoothness of the seat with calloused hands. "Reckon this'll be your special chair," he said, brushing sawdust from his lap. "Something made just for you." Clara pulled the biscuits from the oven, their tops perfectly browned. "It's beautiful already," she replied, watching him work. The care he took in crafting something to fit her size touched her deeply as they shared the warm biscuits. Talk turned to spring plans. Eli sketched a rough garden plot in the scattered sawdust on the table. "Could plant beans here," he said, pointing. "Maybe some squash. What else you fancy growing?" "Tomatoes," Clara answered, her eyes bright with possibility. "And maybe we could get some chickens. Fresh eggs would be such a blessing." Eli nodded, adding to his dust drawing. Might need to build a proper coop, but that won't be too hard. Could have it ready by the time spring brings warmer winds. Their morning passed in such pleasant planning, the future stretching before them like an open road. After their midday meal, Eli announced he needed more firewood. Clara insisted on helping, knowing how quickly they went through wood in the bitter cold. They worked together at the woodpile, loading arms and sled with split logs. The physical labor no longer daunted Clara. Her body, once a source of shame, now proved its worth in honest work. The afternoon sun had begun its descent when they finished, casting long shadows across the snow as they prepared to head back. Something caught Eli's eye. He straightened, squinting at the horizon. "Smoke," he said, his voice suddenly tight with concern. Clara followed his gaze. Dark smoke rose against the pale winter sky, and her heart clenched as she realized its direction. Without a word, they abandoned the wood and hurried toward higher ground, cresting the ridge. Clara's scream shattered the winter silence. Their cabin, their home, was engulfed in flames. Fire devoured the roof, orange tongues licking at the gray sky. They rushed down the slope, snow flying beneath their desperate steps, but they were too late. With a terrible groan, the burning structure collapsed inward. Sparks erupted skyward like a swarm of angry fireflies. The heat pushed them back, forcing them to watch helplessly as their dreams crumbled into embers. When the flames finally died enough to approach, Eli circled the smoking ruins. His face hardened as he found what he was looking for. Boot prints. In the snow, the distinctive treads of railroad men's boots. This was no accident. This was revenge, pure and cruel. "Sabotage," he spat, his voice rough with rage and grief. They salvaged what little they could from the edges of the destruction. Clara's Bible had survived, protected in its oilcloth wrapper. Eli's heavy coat, left hanging on the barn door that morning, was untouched. Their old kettle lay blackened but intact among the ashes. As darkness crept across the valley, they retreated to the barn. It was their only shelter now, its rough walls offering little comfort against the winter night. They huddled together in the hay, wrapped in Eli's coat and horse blankets. Clara's tears fell hot and fast in the darkness. "This is my fault," she sobbed, her whole body shaking. "I brought this curse upon you. If you hadn't taken me in, hadn't stood up for me, they wouldn't have done this. You'd still have your home." Eli's arms encircled her, pulling her close against his chest. "Listen to me," he whispered, his voice fierce despite its tremor. "We will rebuild. Every beam, every board, together." But beneath his determined words, doubt wavered like a candle flame in wind. They sat in silence as the night deepened around them. The barn's timbers creaked in the cold, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called a lonely sound that echoed their own desolation. Clara clutched her rescued Bible to her chest, its familiar weight both comfort and reminder of all they had lost. The warm, hopeful morning felt like a lifetime ago. Their talk of gardens and chickens now lay as cold as the ashes of their home, yet still they held each other, two souls joined in grief, refusing to let go even as their world burned down around them. Morning crept over the mountains, pale and cheerless. Thin wisps of smoke still rose from the blackened ruins of their cabin, carrying the acrid scent of burned dreams. Clara stood beside Eli, her shoulders wrapped in a horse blanket. Watching the last embers die in the cold light of dawn, Eli's face was drawn tight with exhaustion. They had barely slept in the barn, the winter wind finding every crack in the wooden walls. Now he turned to Clara, his voice rough with defeat. "We need help," he said, the words clearly costing his pride. "Can't survive winter in the barn." Clara nodded, understanding how much it hurt him to admit this necessity. Together, they hitched the mule to their small sled and began the slow journey into town. The morning sun did little to warm them as they traveled, and Clara found herself pressing closer to Eli for warmth and comfort. As they approached the town, people were already gathering in the street, word of the fire having spread quickly. Whispers followed their arrival, faces turned to watch their approach. Clara felt her cheeks burn, remembering other times she had been the center of such attention. But something had changed. Martha Wilson, mother of the fevered girl Clara had helped save, stepped forward with a stack of quilts in her arms. "These ain't much," she said softly, "but they're warm and clean." Others followed her lead. Sarah Jenkins brought a basket of fresh bread and dried apples. Old Tom Miller offered a spare lantern. Even those who had once jeered at Clara now stood silent, their faces softened with something like sympathy. Not everyone showed kindness, though. Some townspeople turned away, their backs stiff with disapproval. Clara caught fragments of harsh whispers, brought it on themselves, and that's what comes of taking in strays. Reverend Matthews pushed through the crowd, his gray beard catching the winter sunlight. "Brother Eli," he said, placing a weathered hand on Eli's shoulder. "Sister Clara, the parsonage has a spare room. It's yours until you can rebuild." Clara's eyes filled with grateful tears. "Thank you, Reverend. We're much obliged." But Eli stood rigid, his jaw working. Clara could see how the offer of charity pained him, a man who had always stood alone. The Reverend seemed to understand, adding quietly, "It's not charity, brother. It's what neighbors do." Finally, Eli gave a short nod. They followed the Reverend to the small house beside the church, carrying their meager, salvaged possessions and the gifts from the townspeople. The room was plain but clean, with 2 narrow cots and a small window facing the mountains. Throughout the day, more townspeople came by with offerings, a pot of beans, extra blankets, a few tools saved from summer trading. Each gift seemed to weigh on Eli, though he accepted them with quiet thanks. Clara worked to make their temporary shelter feel more like home, arranging their few belongings and hanging one of Martha's quilts in the window. As evening settled over the town, Clara sat on her cot, watching shadows play across the wooden floor. The day's events had left her heart heavy with worry. She turned to Eli, who sat cleaning his boots by lamplight. "Do you regret it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eli looked up, his scarred hands going still. "Regret what?" "Choosing me. Buying my contract. Standing up for me." Clara's words tumbled out in a rush. "If you hadn't, your cabin would still be standing. You wouldn't be here, accepting handouts." Eli set his boots aside and moved to sit beside her. His rough fingers found hers in the lamplight. "Listen close," he said, his voice low and fierce. "You're my life's one true choice, the only one that matters. Everything else, cabin, land, pride, it's just timber and dirt. But you," he squeezed her hand, "you're the blessing I never thought to ask for." Clara's tears fell freely now, but they were different from the bitter drops she had shed the night before. She lay down on her cot, still holding Eli's hand, and eventually drifted into exhausted sleep. The winter wind rattled the parsonage shutters, a lonely sound in the darkness. Eli lay awake on his cot, watching shadows dance across the rafters. For the first time since he had watched his brothers carried from the battlefield, he felt the urge to pray rise in his chest. Silently, words he had forgotten came back to him. He prayed for strength, for guidance, for protection over the woman sleeping nearby, the woman who had somehow become his whole world. The words were clumsy with disuse, but they came from deep in his heart, rising like smoke to the winter stars above. Life in the parsonage settled into a simple rhythm. The small room felt cramped after the spaciousness of the mountain cabin, but at least they were warm and dry. Clara found herself grateful for even these modest comforts. Remembering nights spent shivering in the auction house, Mrs. Matthews, the preacher's wife, welcomed Clara's help in the kitchen. Together they prepared meals for those less fortunate, thick soups and hearty bread that Clara distributed to tired mothers and hungry children. Her size, once a source of mockery, now proved useful as she carried heavy pots and stacked cords of wood without tiring. Eli spent his days hauling firewood for the church, his strong back bent to the task. Though the work was hard, he took pride in paying their way. Each evening he returned with frost in his beard and satisfaction in his eyes. Knowing they weren't accepting pure charity, snow fell relentlessly that winter. Storm after storm swept down from the mountains, blanketing the town in white drifts. The church bell rang through blizzards, calling the faithful to prayer and the hungry to warm meals. One gray afternoon, while Clara kneaded bread in the parsonage kitchen, Reverend Matthews burst in, clutching a stack of yellowed papers. His eyes sparkled with excitement beneath his gray brows. "Sister Clara," he called, brushing snow from his coat, "I found something remarkable in the church records." He spread the papers on the flour-dusted table. "I was searching for old Property deeds. When I came across this, Clara wiped her hands on her apron and peered at the document. Her heart stopped when she saw the signature at the bottom, Sarah May Wilson. That's my mother's name, she whispered. The Reverend nodded eagerly. It's a land deed, filed 15 years ago. The property borders Eli's Valley to the north, 40 acres of good mountain land, with water rights to the creek. Clara's hands trembled as she touched the faded ink. I never knew. Mama died when I was young, and Papa never mentioned. The filing fee was paid, but the deed was misplaced in church records. By law, as her only living heir, this land is yours, Sister Clara. Tears blurred her vision. She remembered her mother's hands, strong and sure, teaching her to bake and pray and hold her head high. Even now, years after death, her mother was providing for her. When Eli returned that evening, Clara showed him the deed with shaking fingers. He studied it carefully, his scarred hands gentle with the fragile paper. Hope flickered in his deep-set eyes. This changes everything, he said. Softly, the syndicate can't claim what's rightfully yours. With your land and my remaining acres combined, we could rebuild, Clara finished. Make a real home. They sat close together at the parsonage table, the deed spread before them like a map to their future. Outside, snow fell steadily, but inside, warmth bloomed between them. That night, Clara lay awake in her narrow cot, the precious deed tucked beneath her pillow. Thank you, Mama, she whispered into the darkness, and thank you, Lord, for not forgetting your children. Across the room, Eli's voice came soft but determined. I'll fight for what's yours, Clara. We'll face down the syndicate together. Our land, she corrected gently. Our home. The word hung in the air between them, full of promise. Clara felt tears of gratitude slip down her cheeks. After so many years of being unwanted, cast aside, she had found not just shelter, but belonging, not just protection, but partnership. They fell asleep side by side on their separate cots, but their hearts beat as one. Hope had returned to them like a flame rekindled, warming their dreams of spring and new beginnings. Through the parsonage window, stars peeked through breaking clouds, as if heaven itself smiled upon their plans. Dawn painted the eastern sky in pale gold as Eli hitched the mule to their borrowed sled. Clara clutched her mother's deed close, wrapped carefully in oilcloth to protect it from the snow. Her heart fluttered like a trapped bird, hope warring with fear. Ready? Eli asked, helping her onto the sled's wooden seat. His gentle touch steadied her trembling hands. Ready? She whispered, though her voice shook. They set out through fresh-fallen snow toward the county seat, the runner tracks cutting clean lines behind them. The morning air bit sharp and cold, but Clara barely felt it. All her thoughts centered. On the precious document she held, the county clerk's office occupied a stern brick building near the courthouse. Inside, coal fires warmed the air, and the scratch of pen nibs filled the quiet. Clara's boots squeaked on the polished floor as they approached the clerk's desk. Mr. Peterson, the clerk, peered at them over wire-rimmed spectacles, his thin face pinched with doubt when Clara presented the deed. Found in church records, you say? Yes, sir, Clara replied. It belonged to my mother, Sarah May Wilson. The clerk's lips pursed as he examined the yellowed paper. He rose slowly and shuffled to a wall of leather-bound record books. Minutes crept by as he compared dates and signatures, turning pages with meticulous care. Well, he said finally, everything appears to be in order. The filing fees were paid, witnesses signed properly. This deed is legally binding. Relief flooded Clara's chest until the door burst open with a bang. Thomas Durant, the railroad foreman, stormed in, his face red with fury. Snow melted from his expensive boots onto the floorboards. What's this I hear about some forgotten deed? He demanded. That land is slated for railroad development. Eli stepped forward, positioning himself between Clara and Durant. Though the foreman topped him by several inches, Eli stood unwavering. The law's clear on this, he said, voice steady. This here's Clara's land, proper and legal. You've got no claim to it. Durant jabbed a finger at Eli's chest. You think you can stop progress with some dusty paper? The railroad has friends in high places. The deed's valid, Mr. Peterson interrupted. Though his voice quavered, he stood straighter behind his desk. Ms. Wilson's claim takes precedence over any recent railroad surveys. That's the law. Durant's face darkened. He leaned over the clerk's desk, voice dropping to a menacing growl. You'll regret this, Peterson. All of you will. But the clerk, perhaps finding courage in Eli's steady presence, didn't back down. Are you threatening a county official, Mr. Durant? Because I'm sure the judge would be very interested to hear. About that, the foreman straightened, adjusting his coat with forced calm. He shot Clara a venomous look before storming out, slamming the door behind him. The clerk's hands shook as he finished recording the deed in his ledger. Be careful, he warned quietly. Men like that don't give up. Eastly Clara and Eli rode. Home through thickening snowfall, the precious deed now officially recorded and safely stored in Eli's coat. Despite Durant's threats, joy bubbled up inside Clara like a spring. They had won. The land was truly hers. That evening in the parsonage, as lamplight cast warm shadows on the walls, Clara found herself laughing. The sound surprised her. She couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed since the fire. Eli joined in, his deep chuckle harmonizing with hers. Just think, she said, wiping tears of mirth from her eyes. We can rebuild, plant a garden come spring, maybe even raise some chickens. Eli nodded, his eyes soft in the lamplight. A real home, he agreed, better than before. Clara's laughter faded to a thoughtful smile. You know, I used to pray every night to be invisible, to shrink away so nobody would mock me anymore. She touched the worn cover of her Bible. Now I pray for something different. What's that? Eli asked. I pray to shine, she whispered, to stand tall in who God made me to be. Eli reached across the table and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. Clara, he said softly, you already do shine, brighter than any star in heaven. She ducked her head, blushing at his words, but didn't pull away. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing their world in white. But inside, Clara felt only warmth, only hope. The future stretched before them like an unwritten page. Full of possibility, the first warm breeze of spring whispered through the valley. Melting snow in gentle rivulets down the slopes, tender green shoots pushed through the softening earth around the blackened remains of Eli and Clara's cabin. Nature itself seemed eager for renewal. Early morning sun found Clara and Eli sorting through the charred timbers, saving what could be reused and clearing away the rest. The work was hard, but Clara's strength, once mocked, now proved invaluable. She hefted burned beams alongside Eli, her movements sure and steady. Folks are coming, Eli said, straightening up and shading his eyes. A wagon train of neighbors wound up the valley road, tools and supplies loaded high. Clara's heart quickened. Even after months in the community, part of her still expected rejection. But the wagons brought only kindness. Women climbed down carrying baskets of bread and stew pots. Men shouldered axes and saws. Children scampered about, eager to help. We're here to raise your home, announced Samuel Thompson, a weather-beaten farmer who'd once turned away from Clara in church. Now he offered a strong handshake. No family should face spring without proper shelter. Tears pricked Clara's eyes as the community swarmed over the site like busy ants. Men marked foundation lines and began setting fresh posts. Women organized an outdoor kitchen, hanging kettles over cooked fires. Children fetched water and stacked stones for the new hearth. Clara found herself at the center of it all, directing activities with natural authority. Her size, once a source of shame, let her work alongside the men while still overseeing the women's tasks. She moved between groups, hefting beams one moment, tasting stew the next, her voice rising clear and confident over the busy scene. Support beam goes there, she called to one group, pointing. Mind the level. To another, the stew needs more salt, Sarah, and save those wood scraps, they'll do for kindling. Eli paused in his work now and then, watching her with quiet pride. She had bloomed like a spring flower, unfurling in the warmth of acceptance. The neighbors who'd once shunned her now sought her opinion, shared jokes with her, treated her as one of their own, as afternoon shadows lengthened. Children gathered around Clara as she took a brief rest. They begged for stories, clambering. Onto her lap and leaning against her sides, she laughed, the sound rich and free, and began telling them about her mother's herb garden. Eli, stacking firewood nearby, felt his heart swell. There's the heart of our home, he whispered to himself, watching Clara gesture animatedly, the children hanging on her every word. Right there. The day's work ended as dusk painted the sky in soft purple. Though only half-built, the cabin's new framework stood proud against the evening stars. Neighbors departed with promises to return tomorrow, leaving behind gifts of quilts, tools, and food. Clara and Eli sat beside their fire pit, which occupied the space where their new hearth would soon stand. Sparks rose like fireflies into the darkness. The spring air held a hint of lingering winter chill, and Clara drew closer to the flames. "I never thought I'd have this," she said softly, gazing into the fire. "A real home. People who see me as more than just size." Eli added another log to the flames. "They see what I saw that first day. Strength, grace, a heart big enough to match your frame." Clara ducked her head, but not before Eli caught her smile. "You know," she said after a moment, "I never felt beautiful before. Not once in my whole life." She looked up at him, firelight dancing in her eyes. "Not until you looked at me that way." Eli reached out, his calloused hand gentle as he brushed her cheek. "You are the beauty I dreamed of," he said softly. "Not the kind that fades like spring flowers, the kind that endures like mountains. Like faith," his voice grew husky. "The kind that makes a man's heart find its home." Clara leaned into his touch, her arms bright with unshed tears. Around them, the half-built cabin walls rose like a promise. Tomorrow would bring more work, more neighbors, more steps toward their future. But for now, in the firelight, they had found their truth. Love sees with clearer eyes than judgment ever could. The flames crackled softly, sending shadows dancing across the new timber frame. In those shadows, Clara could almost see their future home taking shape. Warm, welcoming, and built on the strongest foundation of all, a love that saw past surfaces to the beauty within. Weeks of labor had transformed the burned ruins into a sturdy new cabin. Fresh-cut pine logs gleamed in the late afternoon sun, the scent of sawdust still lingering in the air. In the yard, a dozen chickens scratched contentedly, while neat wooden stakes marked the boundaries of Clara's future garden plot. The cabin hummed with life as townsfolk crowded inside for the house-raising supper. Fiddle music danced through the rooms, mingling with laughter and the scrape of boots on the new plank floor. Oil lamps cast a warm glow over faces that once showed scorn but now beamed with neighborly affection. Clara moved through the crowd with grace, her broad shoulders straight with pride as she ladled out her mother's venison stew. The recipe had been a gift of love passed down through generations, and now it blessed a new gathering of friends. Women who had once whispered behind their hands now asked eagerly for the secret to her dumplings. The preacher stood by the hearth, raising his hands for silence. "Let us bless this home," he called out, his voice carrying to every corner. "This place stands as testimony to God's providence and the strength of faithful hearts." Heads bowed as he prayed, thanking the Lord for bringing beauty from ashes. When the prayer ended, Eli cleared his throat. All eyes turned to him as he stood, uncomfortable with attention but determined to speak. "I need to thank you all," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "There was a time I thought myself cursed to walk alone. Believed the scars I carried meant I deserved solitude." He glanced at Clara, who stood beside him now, her eyes shining. "But God had other plans. He sent me an angel, disguised as an outcast, and together we found belonging." Clara slipped her arm through his, radiant with joy. The assembled neighbors smiled, nodding in understanding. Where once they had seen only oddness in this pair, the scarred mountain man and his large wife, they now recognized a love that transformed both hearts and minds. As evening deepened, lanterns bobbed like fireflies down the valley road as the last guests departed. Each farewell came with a warm handshake or embrace. Genuine respect having replaced the old mockery. Clara and Eli stood together on their new porch, watching the lights dwindle into darkness. The spring night wrapped around them like a gentle blanket, cricket song rising from the meadow grass. For the first time since their journey began, peace settled fully into their hearts. The dawn painted the mountain valley in shades of gold. Warm light spilling through the cabin's new windows. Birds welcomed the morning with sweet melodies that drifted through the fresh spring air. Inside the kitchen, Clara worked dough with strong, sure hands, the rhythmic motion bringing a smile to her face. The scent of yeast filled the warm room as she kneaded. Pausing now and then to brush flour from her apron, outside, the steady thunk of Eli's axe kept time with her movements. Through the window, she watched him split logs for the cook stove, his shoulders moving with practiced grace. The sight filled her heart with quiet joy. This was their home, their life together, when the morning sun climbed higher. They sat together at their rough-hewn table, sharing a simple breakfast by lamplight. Steam rose from tin cups of coffee. As they talked of dreams taking root like seedlings in spring soil, "Come summer," Eli said, buttering a slice of bread, "we ought to plant apple trees along the south slope." His eyes met Clara's, warm with possibility. "Maybe next year we'll need a cradle, too." Clara's cheeks flushed pink, but her smile was radiant. "I'd like that," she whispered. A home filled with little ones. After breakfast, they walked their land together, fingers intertwined. The valley spread before them like a promised meadows where cattle would graze. Fields waiting for the plow, slopes where fruit trees would someday bloom. Each step felt like a prayer of thanksgiving. As sunset painted the sky in amber and rose, neighbors gathered in their yard for evening prayers. The same people who had once jeered now stood respectfully, heads bowed. Eli's voice rose clear and strong in the quiet. "Lord," he said, squeezing Clara's hand, "I thank you for your greatest gift." He turned to face her, eyes shining with tears and truth. "I dream about your body," he declared, echoing his first tender words to her, "because in it I see my whole." Life Clara's tears flowed freely as she wrapped her arms around him, their embrace witnessed by smiling neighbors. The mockery that had once haunted her dissolved like morning mist in sunshine. Later, they sat together on their porch, watching darkness settle over their valley. Through the window behind them, firelight cast a warm glow, promising shelter and peace. Clara leaned her head against Eli's shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart. They had become more than just husband and wife. They were the heart of their community. Their love, a testament to God's grace. The woman once cruelly called an ox and the scarred mountain man had found not just each other, but their true place in the world. If this story made you pause, reflect, or even smile, don't forget to subscribe. I post daily, and the next story might be exactly what you need to hear.